I feel like I'm content with my body, and I have friends, and I have, love and a partner and all those things, and it can still feel like it's not enough. Like there's still like something else out there. And so I think it's like it has nothing to do with actually getting those things so much as like just being feel like really lost, I think, too, or something I'm feeling.
Hearing your son say he feels lonely and lost is tough for any mom. On today's episode of She is Mother, I sit down with my son, Esteban, a Harvard graduate, talented artist, and a fellow INFJ. We dive into his experience of the world, the factors contributing to his feelings of loneliness, and the challenges facing Generation Z as a whole. Join us in this brave, unfiltered conversation. Okay.
What do you think?
Hi, Esteban.
Hi, Mom. Hi, Dr. A. Or should I call you Mom or Dr. A?
I think you should call me Mom. I think it's really weird for you to call me Dr. A.
Charleanea.
Yeah, or Charleanea. It's just Mom.
English Mom, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting. When did we have this conversation, by the way?
It was, I think...
Or we had it multiple times?
We've had it multiple times. I think we had a good conversation, like, in May, about 4 months ago.
Has it only been that long?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm trying to think what, like, spawned it. I think I was having some issues in Los Angeles with my friend group and my partner, and just trying to, figure out how to ground myself throughout all that.
Yeah, you were talking about, I remember you sharing with me, it's interesting as a mother, it's hard to have these conversations because, moms always want their kids to be okay. Mm-hmm. And so it was interesting to have the conversation. It was actually surprising to me for us to have the conversation because, it made me wonder, your life seems so full. Like you seem to have lots of friends and you travel, and every time we're talking you're at somebody's house or you're going somewhere. So it was surprising. Yet I think for me it spurred a lot of curiosity. And the curiosity was, isn't this interesting? Because it makes me think about what do we, one of the things I thought about was, what do we hand to our children that we don't know we're handing to our children, in terms of, are there patterns, are these patterns that you adopt? Like you see me doing these things and you adopt them and then you take it into your life. Is it about patterns or is it about genetics? Is it in our genes and our DNA, for us to be this way? Is it, it kind of is interesting to me. It's interesting for us to go through the same thing. And obviously in different eras, in different generations, it's really interesting to, that we're going through the same thing or have gone through the same thing.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what the trajectory is for you, because I feel like for me, this is not a challenge that has gone away. It's not resolved.
That didn't make me feel any better to hear.
Well, but I think
in a way it did, but
well, I think part of it is making peace with things, or maybe the answers that you're looking for aren't the answers. Maybe that's what it comes down to, is that what you think the answer is may not be the answer.
I think that's probably the case, because I feel like in our day and age, we just have access to so much information, and it's really easy to diagnose yourself or get a solution really quickly. And I feel like all those solutions just felt like they really haven't done anything for me. And so I think that this conversation, just felt a little bit more grounding in some ways. And I definitely joke that it doesn't get better wasn't necessarily the best thing to hear, but
I don't mean it doesn't get better.
It sounds like it's
the challenge
better.
Isn't resolved.
Yeah.
It's not like the challenge went away. And so the question becomes, well, why is that? Why, I guess what that says to me is that there's not a simple fix, is what it says to me. And also, I can get out there in left field around this. It makes me kind of wonder about, like what, I think about like spiritual curriculum, like why are we here? Each one of us is here for some purpose. And there are certain experiences that are like vehicles for that purpose. And sometimes that experience, it's not that it's good or bad or it's fun or not fun. It's just that there's experiences that help us get to whatever we're trying to go to in terms of our own curriculum and why we're here in our own evolution. So, that's why I think it's not necessarily resolved, because it's like, it's the vehicle. You may be in this vehicle all of your life, or you may not. Who knows? But anyway. Yeah.
And I'm just, I think, learning how to deal with that, because I think I've always thought the vehicle would maybe stop and I could get out and relax.
and get in another car.
Get in another car, like, go to the park or like relax. And I think I'm realizing now at the ripe age of 25 that vehicle is probably just not going to never stop.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I necessarily like that, but I'm learning to live with it.
I remember having the conversation with you. You had called and we talked about this at length. I think we were on the phone for a couple of hours. And I think it's interesting, the timing of this, because you and I just had this conversation, and we've had this conversation before. There's been different iterations of the conversation, but the conversation about feeling lonely and feeling like you just, you don't feel like you have a tribe or you have a family, or, you just don't feel like you've got your people. And I know that we just had this conversation in May, and I know we had this conversation when you were back at Harvard as well. And I think what's interesting is we just had this conversation in May, and now, just a few months later, there's all this this information that's kind of hitting mainstream right now, and there are these findings that are being published that are being talked about right now.
Yeah.
And that is, with the biggest, longest longitudinal study ever done by Dr. Robert Waldinger, found that the single number one predictor of longevity was connection. And so looking at the opposite of that, he basically said loneliness kills us. And he equated it to smoking a half a pack of cigarettes every single day of your life.
Oh my gosh.
So when you think about that, that's really sobering. So, what's interesting about this is this is not just an intellectual conversation. This is something that's really real, and it's impactful. It really does determine your life, your life path, in the sense of not only just satisfaction, am I happy, am I fulfilled with my life, but if you're on this path of chronic loneliness, it can shorten your life. So it's really a big deal. I mean, that's a huge deal. And so I think you and I having this conversation, we might have been ahead of the curve a little bit. I think it's timely, and I think it's really helpful. And I'd like to dig into that a little bit more. And I want to share, here's some interesting, so you're not alone, by the way. I want to share some really interesting statistics.
Tell me.
Yeah, it's interesting. 79, okay, so here we're dealing, let's think about the backdrop. The backdrop is the scientist finds out, and he's trying to figure out what health is about. He's trying to figure out what makes people live longer, right? And he stumbles onto something that maybe he didn't expect to, and that is loneliness is the biggest predictor of someone's longevity or lack of longevity. So that's a really big deal. And so what's interesting about that is you look at that and it's pretty profound, and then you look at statistics. Okay. Statistics show that your generation, Gen Zers, are the...
I'm on the cusp, Gen Z millennial.
Yeah, well, millennials are right behind you, by the way. Millennials are right behind you, but Gen Zers and millennials are the loneliest generation in humankind in recorded history. 79% of Gen Zers describe chronic loneliness. That's followed by 71% of millennials. Wow. Okay. Now, if you go into other generations, you look at, I'm also on the cusp. I'm between baby boomers and Gen X. Gen Xers are 59%, baby boomers are 44%. And here's something that was just really Profound. People from the Great Depression report the least amount of loneliness, 28%. So basically, if you look at generations, Gen Zers and millennials are more than three times
Wow.
more likely to struggle with loneliness than any other generation.
Wow. I mean, it's good to know that I'm not alone.
Right.
I think it's the whole thing with loneliness, I guess, that you're feeling alone.
Here's the thing, and I'm curious if this has come up for you. The fact that 79% of the people in your age group, I know you're on that cusp, 70 to 79%, what that says to me is that there's nothing wrong with you. And I wonder if that's something that you've struggled with. It's like, what's wrong with me? Why am I feeling this? And am I the only one feeling this?
Yeah.
And I wonder what it's like to hear about these numbers. Does it make you feel like there's less likely to be something wrong with you, or do you feel less alone?
I mean, I think it's a struggle. I think to feel less like there's something weird about me. I think that's probably part of the alienating part of loneliness. Is even when I hear those numbers, I believe it and they're really staggering, but I think it still feels like, oh, there's something really, unique about my loneliness. There's something that I'm messing up here. Maybe mine feels different. And I think that I know mentally that's obviously not true, but I think just spiritually, like in my heart, it's like harder to accept that. But I think hearing those numbers are comforting to know that it is of the times. I think for me, what really started this conversation for you and me was that, I graduated college 3 years ago. I think college in and of itself is also a little bit of a wake-up call. It was my first time leaving home, going to a whole new city. I moved from Colorado to the East Coast, and it was really cold. People were like assholes there. They call them like massholes in Massachusetts.
Oh, really?
And it was just a different culture shock. And I think just going to a large, predominantly white institution like Harvard had its own culture shocks in and of itself. So that was difficult, but I thought it was going to get better afterwards. Being in a place like Harvard, I was like, okay, that's just this very unique environment. It's very structured socially, like very specific rules and norms I had to navigate. And I was like, it's going to be better when I go into like the real world in adulthood. And I moved to Los Angeles then, other side of the country. I think it was a lot more like home, just being close on the West Coast. Mm-hmm. But I kind of still felt similar ways. And I think to your point earlier, like I developed a pretty good friend group pretty early on. I dated. I now have a long-term partner. So I feel like I have that really great social infrastructure, but there's just something that made me feel like really disconnected, I think, from other people, from life. There were, days where I think I just felt like really flat or empty. And I don't know if I could quite name it as anything, like whether that was depression or loneliness. And I think what really sparked it for me, what sparked this conversation, I think, was just almost this like thing of a comparison to a degree of like comparing myself to people that I had told myself were just doing it right and that somehow I was fucking up along the way, whether that was my partner or their friends or people that I had told a story about were just had such a much more rich social life than I did. To me, it just felt like I was losing almost, or that there was something like wrong with me. And I found myself just like in this really desperate place whenever that would happen, like I think being with other people was that surface level itch I wanted to scratch. So I'd be okay, I need to find someone, I need to text someone. And when I was single, that might look like, okay, I need to like find, a date or someone to go out with or do something with, or, now that I'm in a relationship, it's like, okay, I need to find my friends. I'm gonna go through the whole Rolodex, try to find someone that's around. And I think that feeling of being physically alone just felt so like daunting and unimaginable to me. So yeah, I think that was like a feeling, but at the same time, I think it's really hard to name that as loneliness. I think it's hard even now to name that as loneliness. Like it's kind of, there's this like, David Foster Wallace like graduation speech where he talks about like this is water, and he talks about this like fish swimming through water, and another fish stops him and says, oh, how's the water today? And the fish said, oh, what's water? Because he's been swimming in it his whole life. It just looks around and just can't pinpoint that. And I feel very like I resonate with that a lot. I think when it comes to loneliness and depression, it's like this thing that's always been there for most of my life, and I just haven't really been able to name it until now, I'd say.
Wow. And so it's felt like your water, basically, all of your life.
I think in a way, yeah.
That's interesting. It's interesting about what you're sharing is, you read this study, for example, and the anecdote is just have connections, have more friends.
Yeah.
And what you're sharing with me is you're basically saying that it's not that simple. You have friends, you have connections, right? And yet you still struggle with this feeling that you have now labeled loneliness. I'm curious, before you labeled it, like, could you describe the feeling? Like, how would you say it was? I've heard emptiness. I heard blah. I mean, how did you even get to this idea that I might be lonely?
I think that's a good question. I think it was honestly pinpointing like when it would happen and like under what circumstances it would, like, this feeling would come up. I think it's kind of always humming, in the back of my mind or around me somewhere, but it gets quieter sometimes and louder in other times. I think for me, when it would get louder was often like at night, I think. I think that's when it was harder. I also think it would get worse for me when I just like was alone. Like, I think that was the point where it almost just kind of magnetically like switched for me. I remember when I was in college, it was like a very similar feeling of like, I'd have classes all day, I'd have my routine in the morning, and I'd, get up, have breakfast and see people. And so that filled most of my day. And then like around 4 or 5 is like kind of when that feeling of dread would just kick in. Like, it's when the sun started to set. I think I told myself everyone else was having time with their friends or doing things or going to parties or whatever that might be. And I wasn't invited, I think was the story to tell myself. I didn't feel welcome there. And so I think because of that, what I would tell myself is like, not necessarily that I'm lonely, but just that I'm like, there's something wrong with me. I think that like I'm not being invited to these spaces because, I'm broken in some way, or I'm not good enough, or I don't fit in. I think it's something I would tell myself a lot. And I think that feeling was definitely magnified in a place like Harvard, where I think just ultimately there's a larger bit of that at the campus.
You really didn't fit in.
There were places like that. In some spaces, like, and I had to learn to pick my battles, and I probably didn't even learn that until after I left. But yeah, it sucked there. But I think it's also just been following me for most of my life. I think it's a mixture of being the person I am, being in the body that I am, being in the place that I am, the time, like all those things. I think I just have this kind of deep feeling of like disconnect, I think, in a lot of ways from the world. And I'm very fortunate and lucky that I do have people in my life, like you, of course, and other people that I think have made me feel really connected and grounded. But yeah, I think it's been hard to come by in my life.
It's interesting to hear you talk about this, because I'm really just taking it in. And as I take it in, what I'm hearing you say is that this experience of loneliness, you're also using the word disconnect, and I think that's a really important word, and we'll continue to talk about that. I'm just going to set that aside for a second. What I'm struck by is, one, you said, I've felt this for a very long time. And so what that means to me is that you've probably felt this for as long as you have awareness. So when I think about that, we start to remember or have awareness about 4 or 5 probably. And so when I hear that, it's like, okay, a lot of your external circumstances changed, yet this internal experience didn't. And so like, I think about, my being your mother and watching you grow, like I think about, when you, especially like when you were in your higher elementary school years, like 4th and 5th grade and 6th and 7th, I watched you through those years in high school, and you had a really strong friend group, and, your friends adored you, they thought you were amazing. I mean, people loved you, and you just seemed like you had this tribe. And so for me to hear that you had these experiences, yet there was just something that wasn't connecting for you, it really makes me wonder, again, is this really just as simple as you just have to connect with people? What that tells me is it's not that. That and I'm not saying that doesn't exist for some people. I'm sure that there are people out in the world, doesn't matter what age they are, that there are people out in the world who genuinely do not have their people. They don't have their tribe. They don't have their community, and they feel alone or lonely as a result. Yet it seems like what you're describing to me, it's not that. It's like there's something that is much more of an internal battle or struggle that has less to do with whether or not you have your people or not. I mean, is that fair? Is that a fair observation on my part?
I would definitely say so. Yeah, I would definitely say so. I think, yeah, I was really fortunate, I think, in that I did find like friends and friend groups, and, you know, I wasn't completely alone. I think there's people out there that feel like they just don't have any of those connections. And I think for me, I think I was just, you know, I think you and I have also talked a lot about this too, is I think growing up, I just always felt like I have like no better word for it than just like this like alien almost kind of like dropped onto like Earth. I think it's like very like familiar experience I had for most of my life, and I think it's like I just felt like very foreign, I'd say, in like the place that I grew up in. And I think it's a combination of things. You know, I think it's you know, just my race and ethnicity. You know, I'm Latino, and I think I grew up in an area where there weren't a lot of, you know, Latinx representation. And I think also like I'm queer, and obviously I wasn't queer. I didn't know I was queer when I was a little kid, but I think there's always something about me that, you know, just marked me as different, you know, since I think
you felt different.
I felt different. I think people perceived me as different all the time. Like, I think then those like moments just made me feel very like isolated, I think, like, because also it was a different time, you know, and I you know this better than anyone, just how, you know, homophobic the world is and was. But, you know, I think from an early age, I was just being called out for being gay or feminine, or, you know, that was like a very early experience I can remember. And I think it was a combination of how I was perceived and how I felt in the world. You know, like, I didn't really feel like a boy growing up at all, and I didn't want to be with other boys. And, you know, I you know, like, I had a lot of like friends that were girls growing up, and that was great, but I also think I felt very like isolated from that experience too. You know, I was.
Well, you didn't feel like you could relate to other boys.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember when you were playing. Do you remember what you told me when you were playing soccer?
No.
So you were really good at soccer, by the way.
Really?
Yes, you really were. Yeah, I started you playing soccer at 4 years old, and you were the only person on the entire team that understood that you needed to get to the ball to the goal, and you were really good at it. And I thought, oh, he's really good at this, you know. And I asked you if you wanted. You played a season. And I asked you, do you want to play? And you said, no, I don't want to play. And I said, well, why? And you said, I don't like boys. They smell and they're stupid. So, you know, I guess I knew that about you, that you were not a typical boy. You didn't like typical boy things. For me, I didn't jump to this place, though. Oh, you must be gay. I never jumped to that place, and it wasn't.
I think you're like the only one, probably.
Well, and I think part of it is because I'm very open, and part of it too is, I'll be honest, I have a problem with labels, and I don't like it when people are put in boxes, because when you put somebody in a box, you really limit who they really are in their essence, and who they, you know, you're limiting that. You know, you're making them smaller than what they are, and so I was really against that anyway. But it didn't matter to me. You know, for me, what it was is I paid attention to you. Like, I paid attention to what did you like, what did you not like, you know, and I didn't ever want to force you to do boy things, or, you know, it was important to me.
Yeah.
But it sounds like for you, and it's interesting to have the conversation, because I'm struck by this idea of, you know, some people believe, this is really interesting, some people believe that what you don't personally resolve in yourself, you actually hand down to your kids. And the question is, what's the mechanism for handing it down? Is it behavior? Is it they watch patterns and they adopt those patterns? Is it in the DNA? You know, they talk about epigenetics, for example. Epigenetics are passing down emotional experiences. You know, like they talk about intergenerational trauma. Is intergenerational trauma, is it passed down from generations because it's in our DNA and we inherit it, or do we learn it because of patterns that are so subtle? You know, it's hard to say, but I think what I'm struck by is, obviously I grew up at a different time than you did.
Totally.
And you and I have similarities. You know, obviously we're both brown. Now, what's interesting is I'm not as brown as you are. So I probably have not had the same experiences you have had, because, you know, I can pass. Okay, that's one side of it. The other side of it, though, is I also grew up at a time where prejudice was even stronger.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't, you know, I struggled with the same things you did. And I think it's interesting to hear you say this. And I think this is the first time I've heard you say this. And what's eerie about it is I have said something very similar, you know, in my own process. And that is, I felt like where the hell did I come from? Because I don't belong here. Like in my own family, like my own family of origin, my brothers and my mom and my dad and my grandparents and aunts and uncles. It was like, I don't belong here. You know, I felt like an alien, you know, and I think that's interesting that because I hadn't heard you say that. And so what I'm struck by about that is it makes me think that this is a deeply personal struggle that may be even independent of circumstances. Because think about it this way, you know, I even think about it for me is like, you know, when you're younger, like if you're 4 and 5, you're not developmentally at a place where you are social. So it can't be about how many friends you have, yet you're still having that experience. And so I'm really struck by that. You know, it's like, again, I think loneliness, there's a complexity to it. And, you know, what are the different layers to it? You know, like what are the different layers that lead someone to feeling lonely? And, you know, obviously you and I have had this conversation and continue to have this conversation. And, you know, maybe what it is that you just inherently feel different. And, you know, but how do we know that? I mean, that's what I'm also struck by. It's like, how do we know that? Like, what
that
is
we're
it?
Different,
yeah, like how, because we know that early on, you know, I can remember being 4 and going, I don't belong here. I am not like these people. and it wasn't that I thought I was better than these people. It was just like, I can't relate to them. Like their sense of their worldview and their sense of reality and the way they navigate through the world, I'm just puzzled by.
Well, you grew up in the Catholic Church too.
Well, but I also grew up in a very, I think what's really weird about this is I did not know, this is going to sound really crazy, I did not know that I was Latina until I got into college and somebody told me I was. You know, seriously, I mean, I grew up very Latina. You know, if you look at my upbringing, you know, it was a very traditional Latin household. And what I mean by that is, what I think is funny about this, it's very, you know, patriarchal, but really, it's matriarchal because the women are in charge, but the women have no power, right? Women are taking care of everybody. And so that was what was modeled to me is, you know, women stayed home and they had children and they took care of their husbands and they cooked and they cleaned. And, you know, traditional Latin meals and, you know, gender roles and, you know, certain expectations of males and females. I mean, I grew up in a very traditional, Latin household, yet it's like the fish in the water. I didn't know anything. And then I went into college, and I remember when I applied for college, and, you know, I look back at this, I didn't understand it. Now I look back at it and it makes me angry. I remember when I applied for college and I got accepted into one college and they said, you have a conditional acceptance. And the conditional acceptance was that I had to take remedial English classes.
Wow.
So they made an assumption about me. Yeah. You know, and here's the irony is I took advanced placement in English in high school and I got straight A's. Yeah. You know, and it didn't matter. But that was when I realized, oh, I'm ethnically different than everybody else. And then when I look back, I go, oh, that's what that meant. And that's what that meant. Because I didn't have that lens. Yet even without that, because you're saying, you know, the whole idea of being different, for you, you're ascribing it to being Latino, being brown, being queer. You know, I also wonder about personality. You know, I know one of the things, I think it's funny how much we share together, right? We're both INFJs, and that Myers-Briggs personality traits. It's the rarest personality type, but one of a really strong characteristic about INFJs is that they're so rare. They don't have their people. And so, you know, there's that personality variable as well that can make you feel really different. And I'm sure that there are other things, but I think it's fascinating that you and I have struggled with the same thing within a different, I wouldn't say it's drastically different social context, but it is a different social context.
Definitely, yeah.
You know?
Yeah, you were talking about like the difference in like our experiences and also the similarities with those. You know, I think that I also, it's interesting because I think I had those similar experiences of feeling very like alien and very foreign, and at the same time, I think that I had the privilege of just growing up in the family that I did, you know, which is with you and, you know, you and Sky, you know, your partner, and my grandmother Rachel. It was a family of all women, I think was one thing in particular. And, you know, it was a queer family, I think. And I think that because that there was a lot of room to like blossom and grow and kind of be who I wanted to be. And I had, you know, queer like, you know, mentors, which is like such a rarity. I think when I talk to most of my queer friends about that, I've only met a handful of people that also have queer parents, and that's a very unique experience. So I'm very lucky that I had that, but at the same time, I think there was just a lot of things that still felt very, I think, different too. You know, for me, like I think, you know, you talk about not feeling like you were Latina until you went to college. You know, I think I think I grew up in a time of a lot less prejudice than you did, but I think it was really interesting and kind of surreal, maybe, how race was treated when I was growing up, because from what I understand, I think in your time, you know, race was treated as like you might be the victim of like a hate crime, or people might think that you're stupid, or, you know, anything like that. Whereas I feel like for when I grew up, it was a lot more like quiet and insidious and like just kind of lurking there. People would make assumptions. Like I'd be told I'm very, you know, smart, or like smart for being, you know, Latino, or people wouldn't be able to pronounce my name. And I think it's like small things. And of course, you know, for our generation, we call these like microaggressions, you know, because they feel tiny, but when they add up over time, it like contributes this whole feeling of being different. I'm sure that you've dealt with many microaggressions in your life too, as well as probably macroaggressions too.
Right.
So I think that's one thing. Yeah, I'm trying to think about what else from there though. Or there's something else I was gonna say. Oh, the other thing I was gonna say too is, you know, we're talking about personality types. You know, I think for my personality, I'm a little more quiet and introspective, and I think another big part of my identity is just being, you know, smart. You know, I'm smart. I think I got that from you as well. You know, you're also very smart, and I think it's been a big part of my identity. And there's this thing, I'm not sure if you've heard of this before, called like the like golden boy, like it's like the golden boy rule or the golden boy something. It's this concept that a lot of like young queer boys, like gay boys, oftentimes find like refuge or solace in being really smart or really talented or really gifted. They kind of become like this perfect golden child, perfect person, and someone that almost like as a way to like deflect attention from other parts of your identity. And I think that's definitely something that I really grew up with, you know, very internalized, was that I need to perform, I need to be great, I need to be excellent, which I think is a very common experience for people from all backgrounds or all even sexualities. But I think that kind of like added another layer that was like, I can be myself, I can kind of outgrow these labels if I'm smart. You know, I'm not going to be just Latino, I'm going to be smart. Not that those are diametrically opposed, but I think in people's minds, oftentimes those were when I grew up. And same with being like gay. It's like, okay, well, I'm not just this like dumb, you know, twink. Like, I can say that I'm gay. But, you know, like it's like I'm not just gonna be this dumb twink. I'm gonna be someone that's also really smart. And I think it was my worst fear growing up that someone would think I'm just one of those things. And I think it just felt really big to me, or like really like, scary to me. Yeah.
So it's interesting. So for you, you're being really smart and intelligent. You use that almost as a shield. Like, you know, that was, you know, it was interesting because you said, you know, I felt like there was something wrong with me, you know, like I didn't belong here and there was something wrong with me. You know, on one hand, being really smart and doing really well. And I know you got a lot of acknowledgement from that, from a lot of people inside and outside of the family. And on one hand, that may have, you know, redeemed you, or, so, you know, made you less different. Or I want to say, you know, I think a lot of times what happens for us is when we feel different, then we judge different as something's wrong with us. Different isn't celebrated.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be nice. I think we're getting in that direction, but we're still far from that. So what I wonder about is even your intelligence, if that was a mixed bag as well, because on one hand, it could make you shine and maybe, you know, make up for is being weird or whatever. But at the same time, that also set you apart, you know, because being really intelligent, you know, you experience the world very differently. Your mind is very different. And so having conversations with people can not feel right, you know, because it's just the way that you experience the world and the things that are salient for you or resonant for you and what you're paying attention to may be worlds away from, you know, your peers.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if that was a mixed bag for you too.
I think definitely a mixed bag. Definitely. I think it's all those things, but like it's also something that is redeeming for me, but also kind of keeps propping me up on this different level from other people. And I think that's something that I think when we talk about like what's contributing to loneliness, I think that's definitely something that was really contributing to me, was just this feeling of, I think like almost like uniqueness. And I don't want it to sound like I have these big delusions of grandeur, like an inflated ego, but I think on top of feeling like just different, I also felt like, yeah, just different and unique and special. And I think everyone wants to feel special, but I think with that, it's hard to, it's easy to overlook the connections that we have, or the similarities we have with other people. And I also think it's like a very like American thing too, which like, you know, individualism and, you know, all those things I think are something I'm thinking about. And I think it's also not just about being smart, you know, I think it's so many different things, you know. I think a lot of people my age, a lot of Gen Z folks are really flocking to the idea of, well, this sounds bad. It's the concept of neurodivergence. Let me rephrase it. The concept of neurodivergence is gaining a lot more traction, I think, around people my age. It's not that there's an uptick of people that are neurodivergent, you know, meaning they're, you know, on the spectrum or have some, you know, whatever that may look like. I think it's just there's like a way to name an experience that a lot of people are having. You know, I think me being intelligent is a lot different from being on the spectrum or having another form of neurodivergence. But nevertheless, I think it's a common experience of the way that our brains work, make us feel at odds with the world around us, or make us feel really disconnected. And, you know, I'm not, I don't know. We'll see if we're going to include this after I say this, because it might be bad. But I also feel like it's not that Gen Z is becoming more neurodivergent, but I also think that in our era of like isolation and like, you know, being separate from each other and like seeing the world through a screen, I think it's very easy to build up a lot of those same, for our mind to work in that way, like where it feels like really hard to connect with other people or to feel like we're able to see someone beyond just through a screen, basically. And so, yeah, I'm not sure what that full thought is, but I think that that's something I'm thinking about. What do you think about that?
Can you say more about that? Like, what do you mean when you say screen?
I mean, I think where my mind is going to is that I think that a lot of people my age, and it's something that I'm definitely experiencing a lot too, like I feel like in the past, even just like 3 to 4 years since the pandemic, I feel like I just really struggled to be around other people. Like it's very difficult. And I think it's queuing up a lot of the like mental like struggles, or like the way that my mind works when it's like feeling it's most isolated or feeling like it's most like unable to be social. And I think that was the connection I was making with neurodivergence, is just this element of feeling really like at odds with what's happening around you. So it might be that, you know, that it's hard to like make eye contact with people, or it's hard to feel like you can like actually physically be with someone in the way that I used to. And I don't know if there was ever that perfect time that I used to be around other people, but I think it's definitely become exacerbated nowadays, you know. And I also work from home, so I see people through a screen now, and when I'm not seeing people through a screen, it's like a select group of like 5 to 10 people that I see all the time. And besides that, when it's like new people, when it's at parties, I feel like super anxious, which almost makes it even harder to connect. Like I feel like I'm always on guard now when I'm in public.
Is that an experience that you've always had, has been on guard, and you're just more aware of it? Or is that something that's grown over time?
I think both. I think I've always been on, you know, I think I've always been on guard. I think that they feel like different experiences though, slightly. You know, I think that when I was a kid, I was really on guard about being perceived in like my body, I think. Like I was really on guard about my gestures, my mannerisms, you know, was I seeming too flamboyant or too gay, or like how was I talking, and did I, you know, look like fat was something I was thinking a lot about too. I was like really uncomfortable with my body, and I think those are all things that I thought a lot about. And I still, like, obviously a lot of those questions still go through my mind even today. I have a lot different relationship with all those things, you know, my body, my race, and my sexuality. Those are all, I have a different relationship with those now. But I think now I'm also thinking about, you know, things like, is this person judging me? You know, like maybe not for those things, but am I cool enough? Am I not cool enough? And I think in a more like of the times thing, I'm thinking a lot about like sickness and like being near people, and like what does it mean to be exposed to people or be near people. And I think just also in this day and age, I'm thinking a lot about like safety. Like I think I feel really unsafe in public now, which I think is a really hard feeling, kind of like a contradicting feeling, like wanting to connect with people and also being worried about, am I going to make it home, you know, being around these people, being in public. And
what's the unsafety about?
I mean, I think it's, I mean, in my mind, I think a lot about this. Maybe I'm just like unique in this, but I don't think so about just like, you know, gun violence is something I think a lot about. And, you know, yeah, I think that's just something that's on my mind a lot.
So it's a lot about the social context, that the world doesn't feel safe anymore. I mean, you turn on the TV and, you know, there's some mass shooting somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Mass shootings are common. You know, I don't remember a mass shooting as a young person.
Yeah.
You know, yet it's interesting to hear that, because I think in some ways, you know, the shared experience for you and me is also that guardedness. Like I remember being really young and, you know, people wanting to connect with me, like friends and peers, and like I didn't have an interest in it. Like, and it wasn't an interest like I don't have an interest, it's not interesting to me. It was more of this, I'm more comfortable with having you over there, you know, and I think I had that guardedness as well, but I think it was different. I think for me, you know, growing up in an environment that didn't feel safe, you know, with the violence in my own home, you know, the domestic violence and the physical abuse and what I was exposed to, for me, the world didn't feel safe. You know, so it was the same idea. The world doesn't feel safe, but for very different reasons, because my home wasn't safe. And I think that it resulted in me having this orientation to the world of, okay, I need to be protecting myself all of the time, because I don't know if I can trust you, and I don't know if I'm physically safe or emotionally safe because of my experience. But it's interesting. I think at the end result is the same, is you're guarded, and when you're guarded, you're closed off, and when you're closed off, then you really aren't open completely to connection. You talked about in the beginning, when you recognized that this was, you called it loneliness. You used a word, disconnection. And then what was interesting, you were talking just a couple of minutes ago about recognizing, it's probably at some point you got into school, really being very concerned about how people perceived you, and you being very self-conscious about your body, you know, and recognizing your body wasn't the ideal body, or, you know, worried about your mannerisms or your interests, and, you know, and people judging you for that. And, you know, one of the things that I wonder about with disconnect is that sometimes what happens for us is when we think there's something wrong with us, we have a tendency to hide. Okay, we hide behind something, you know, whether it's our achievements or something like that. And the fallout or the repercussions of that is when we hide, we're actually hiding from ourselves. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's like if we feel like there's something wrong with us, you know, we can sometimes have shame around that, or, you know, we don't feel good about ourselves. And so we actually disconnect from ourselves. Like we start disowning parts of ourselves that we don't believe are ideal. So you think about when you were saying, you know, being Latino and recognizing that, you know, experiencing microaggressions, or, you know, feeling like people treat you differently because of the color of your skin, or, you know, because of the body that you were in, you know, in terms of its shape or size. You know, I wonder if for you, if you just started closing down these parts of you, and that if if the loneliness could partially be being disconnected from yourself. I don't know if you've ever thought about that.
I mean, I think recently I've thought more about that. Yeah, I think I definitely shut down a lot of my connections to myself, like through those avenues, just because it felt really wrong or something I just didn't really want in my life. Like I think there was a large part of my life where I wanted to be white, and I wanted to be straight, and I wanted all these things that I thought once I got those, I could finally feel at peace. I could finally feel, or I wanted to be like, ripped. I still want to be ripped. I still want to be like really muscular, but I'm okay that I'm not, but I thought like once I had all those things, I'd be like enough. And I think even in school or in my social life, I think I would, latch on to just these really like kind of flimsy images. Once I somewhat moved on from those things, like whiteness or straightness, whatever that was, it would start to go into like, oh, this person is, looks really great on Instagram, like they're going to this cool vacation, or, they're at this cool party they didn't get to go to, or they're on this beach that I'm not on, or, whatever that might be. And so I think it's something I've always kind of been guilty of is projecting this thing out there that's like, okay, this is the standard. And once I have that, then I can be stable and happy. And I think it's put me in this trap where I actually have obtained some of those things. I feel like I'm content with my body, and I have friends, and I have, love and a partner and all those things. And it can still feel like it's not enough. Like there's still like something else out there.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's like, it has nothing to do with actually getting those things so much as like, just made me feel like really lost, I think too, is something I'm feeling.
And when you say lost, what do you mean?
I feel like I'm just kind of going through like the motions sometimes. Like I feel like I think just like feel like maybe just like feel like spiritually like dead almost. And that's not really dramatic, I think, but just also like, yeah, like I feel like I'm just not really like awake sometimes. I feel like I'm just kind of like slogging through things, and it feels something like what could be like depression or loneliness, these like nebulous concepts out there. But yeah, I don't know, does that answer your question?
No, it's interesting to hear. I mean, it just struck me that you said lost. It made me think of The Lost Generation with Ernest Hemingway.
Oh, yeah.
Ernest
I know
Hemingway.
You like Ernest Hemingway.
Well, but it just made me think about that. It was about disillusionment, right? A disillusionment and existential crisis, right? The Lost Generation. And it makes me kind of wonder, is history repeating itself in the sense of, it just hit me in this moment as you said that. It's like, are Gen Zers the lost generation? Like, one of the things that I've thought about, with loneliness, and I mean, now we're going to get into another topic. I don't want to go too far out there, but this idea of hopelessness.
Yeah.
That it almost feels like it's the cousin, the loneliness and the hopelessness, like the things, I think about my generation, for example, or the baby boomer generation, that there were things to look forward to. We were, our culture, our society showed us, things that, we wanted, and those things aren't available to you in that way. You know? And so I wonder, you were talking about feeling spiritually dead. And I wonder if there's something about the current circumstances and where we are in our history that you don't feel connected to that kind of hope, and I don't know, sometimes I feel like that hope makes you feel alive, and that hope makes you feel connected, and hope, it makes you feel hopeful. It's something to look forward to. And I wonder if that's something that's really missing in your generation. And loneliness is not just about people. Loneliness is about loss. It's interesting. They're so close together. When you think about, okay, you said disconnection. Well, what's disconnection? Disconnection is loss of connection to you. Disconnection can be loss of connection to somebody that you feel they get you. they get you. You resonate with them. You can relate to them. You feel like they understand you and you understand them. And so, it makes me kind of wonder if it's kind of like a double-edged sword, meaning you feel lonely and you feel like you don't belong. And at the same time, you experience the loss related to that. Because I think innately, we are designed to be connected to each other. Mm-hmm. I mean, we really are. I mean, it's really interesting in today's time, all of the amazing advances that are coming up in sciences, social sciences in particular. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about something, Daniel Siegel has written some books on this idea of what he calls co-regulation. Mm-hmm. And he basically says that we regulate each other. So we're not only in charge of our own regulation emotionally, but being in the room with another person can regulate us. Mm. Our nervous systems can regulate each other. And so we're designed to be connected. And so if you're in a world where you're not feeling connected, you're not feeling connected to yourself, you're not feeling connected to another, others, what happens for you? Like you said, you feel that deadness inside. Mm-hmm. You're thinking about these different elements of what really kind of feeds into the loneliness. Mm-hmm. Talking about the hopelessness, but the other thing that you brought up was, the whole idea of feeling different and feeling like you don't fit in, right? Now, throw in social media. You talked about that. You're looking out on these platforms and you're seeing all these people that are telling you, showing you how wonderful their life is and that they have it all. And you're like, it just exacerbates the feelings of there's something wrong with me because I'm not them. I don't have it all. I don't have the tons of friends. And, and I think that, social media has really made things very difficult for people. I think that it's actually made loneliness and disconnection even more rampant. Because I think a number of things. One is what you just described, is you already feel like there's something wrong with you. And then you look at all these people that are showing how wonderful their lives are. And it's like, okay, it's obviously possible because they're doing it. And side note, it's probably all a bunch of BS. But anyway, believe me, right. I've had that experience where I'm like, friends, I'm jealous. Like, look what they're doing. And then the next thing I know, they're getting divorced. So I know that you can't always believe what you see on social media. Sure. Nonetheless, you buy into the story. You buy into the story that they know something or they have something that you don't have. And somehow you're just not up to par, and that actually increases the feelings of being different and something wrong with you, which increases the isolation. So you have that aspect of social media, right? Mm-hmm. I think the other thing that I've thought about, and I've dealt, not only, I mean, you're not the only one struggling with this. I mean, there are a lot of people that are struggling with loneliness in all age groups, and I know that even like with my clients, I've got clients that are 30 somethings, 40 somethings, 50 somethings, and they're experiencing a lot of the same thing, that loneliness and that disconnect and that emptiness and that dead feeling inside. And, one of the things that I see with them is they're spending a lot of time on social media. Mm-hmm. It's almost like an addiction. They talk about death scrolling. That is really a thing. I talk to my clients about, you're doom
scrolling.
The doom scrolling. Yeah. Doom scrolling. Yeah. That, it's really bad for your psyche. It's really bad for your mental health, for the same reasons that you're describing. I think the other thing that happens is it gives you it's an illusion. Mm-hmm. It gives you this false sense of connecting and socializing. And you're not. You're just exchanging information or you're gathering information when you really think about that. Yeah. I mean, think about something this simple. Texting a friend, for example, versus sitting right next to them and having the same conversation is miles apart in difference. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think people realize that we as human beings, we are sensing beings, we're feeling beings, and we think everything's up here, and it's not. We can be in a room with somebody and get so much more fulfillment out of connecting in a room with another person than texting a friend on our iPhones or, connecting through chats or whatever. And I think that's part of the other issue here is that social media is not only filling a lot of space, but social media, there's no meat to it. There really isn't any connection to it. Yet you spend a lot, and I think the younger generations are spending a lot more time on their phones than any other generation.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just like taking a breath through that. I think there's a lot that I'm thinking about with all that. And I think as you're talking, I'm agreeing with all this, and I'm trying to, I think, reconcile all these different things that are going through my mind right now, like in relation to what you're talking about. I think on one hand, of course, like there is that, just like it's like an addiction to our cell phones. I'm like going to expand it beyond just social media and just their cell phones in general. I think there's, a few, or just media in general. I think there's many different avenues in which I'm on social media specifically. Like I'm on social media and I'm getting those experiences from like my friends who are projecting this really happy, great life, like we talked about. I think also with you talking about it being the lost generation, I think there's also something very specifically happening with our generation. Everyone's experiencing this, but I think our generation's experiencing it the most acutely right now is just this profound like hopelessness, I think, as you've talked about. I think it's something very specific to, the times right now. I can try to convince myself that things are okay, things are, fine. But then I feel like I need to like stay like stitched to my phone to get information about the presidential election, like the, assault on our rights, the threat of fascism in our country and violence in our country and violence in, Palestine, just like, the killing and murdering of just tens of thousands of innocent Palestinian people and, all these just like war crimes and, climate change and all these things at once. It feels like the world is just, I think, caving in. And on top of that, I'm also dealing with, my body dysmorphia or wanting to, be hot enough or wanting to be cool enough or go to this party. And I think that like whiplash is really hard. And I feel like a little ashamed to admit that. So I think that's one element. I think the other element too is that, just with what we were just talking about earlier, which is like hopelessness. I think when I'm in that hopeless place, it's hard. I feel like I'm like, you're talking about there's like no meat to social media. I feel like I'm one craving that meat, craving that connection.
The sustenance.
And I think at the same time, because of that, deluge of information and just like feeling paralyzed by that, it kind of almost cripples me in a way, I think. And to do those things that might bring me closer to people, and so when it comes to sharing my emotions or sharing how I'm feeling, I feel like I don't have anything to say besides like I'm fine or I'm okay, or I feel like I don't have like the language for it. And even when my friends and I can joke about like, oh, like the world's on fire, everything's going to shit, like we're probably not gonna be able to have kids because they're gonna, die on this earth. Like it's kind of like a haha moment. It's kind of almost like absurdity, I think, that we're living in right now, and we just kind of have to move on from it. And it feels like there's no space for, I feel like all of us are just experiencing this world from like our one singular point of view. That's kind of just how life works. Like we're ultimately just confined to this one perspective we have that feels so uniquely special and painful and isolating. And at the same time, everyone's experiencing that right now. And I think that's something that I'm also thinking about, is that feeling.
Right.
And I think that brings us to the top of the conversation. We're talking about everyone's experiencing loneliness. I think everyone's experiencing all of these things, and it's just kind of crazy just to be sitting here on this earth and just like, not really talking about it, just kind of sitting with it.
Right. And it's interesting that we're slapping a label on it, loneliness.
Yeah, like that even feels a little inadequate to me.
Well, it does, doesn't it? Because it, like we were saying, it feels so complex. Like it's not just about, I don't feel connected to other people. It just seems like there's just so much complexity to it, like I was saying earlier that, we talk about, okay, well, here are the things that you're struggling with. I've struggled with these things as well. I know they're not exactly the same, but there's a lot of overlap in those things. And, the answer isn't just go out and get more friends. That really, you've shown that's not it. Mm-hmm. It's not really that, because there's something much more fundamentally deeper about this experience, in the sense of, I believe that number one, I think the disconnection is disconnection from ourselves. Whether it's we are hiding from ourselves because we're not ideal in whatever way, whether it's the body, whether it's the sexual orientation, whether it doesn't matter. It's just that we are turning our backs on ourselves because of our own judgment and fear of perceived judgment from others.
I'm curious, like with that, like I know, sorry to interrupt, but I'm curious, like, you had talked about that you were experiencing a lot of those things too. Like, I'm curious what your journey was like with all that and how you came to terms with that. I know it's like a very, maybe you didn't have this backdrop of crisis that we're living in right now, but what was that like for you to navigate that?
I think it's really interesting to have very similar experiences with very different social contexts, right? I can remember being 23 and 22, 23, and literally I could tell you exactly where I was like, I am really lonely. I feel alone in the world, and I was desperate. Like I just was craving connection, and
do you remember where you were?
Yeah, I was down in I was literally in my bedroom. I mean, I remember going through, it was like a crisis. It was like, I was really struggling and thinking about, for me, I thought the answer was easy. I just needed to have a partner. I was a late bloomer. I didn't have a significant relationship until I was 24. I dated a lot, but I didn't have any significant relationship. And I thought that's what it was. And what I realized as I got older and life unfolded, this feeling of loneliness perpetuated. And what I realized was it was a number of things. And these are similar to what you're describing, but I also think there are things that you experience that I don't, that actually even add fuel to that fire. And I think for me, what I realized, first and foremost, is that I was completely disconnected from myself. And it was because of trauma. And I think it's interesting that we're having this conversation because, again, I'm just struck by our similar paths that, I also had a lot of body dysmorphia. And I didn't want to be in my body, and I didn't like my body, and I felt that my body was not ideal. And, I believed that people were judging me because of my body. And I think that was part of the disconnect. I think the other disconnect was the trauma, the trauma, and surviving so much trauma. The way that you survive trauma is disconnecting from yourself. You disconnect from the parts of you that are holding these experiences that feel overwhelming. And I think another part of it was I didn't feel like I fit in. I just didn't feel like I fit in. And it's weird because for you were able to put your finger on things because you didn't fit in. You're talking about your brownness. You're talking about your body. You were talking about, your sexual identity. And I didn't have those things. Like I didn't think, oh, I don't fit in because I'm brown, or I don't fit in because I think differently. I just had this pervasive feeling that was just nebulous. I don't belong here. And I couldn't tell you why. I just always had that chronic feeling. And I don't think that feeling ever really went away. And then when I got older, and when I say older, I'm talking 50s, I'm almost 60 now. What I realized was that I wasn't connected to me. That was most important, was that and I've been striving for this, is to get to a place where my strongest relationship is with myself, and that it's internal, and that, it starts here, and accepting myself, and, being okay with being different, and that difference okay. And we're all different, and there are ways in which we're the same, and, and embracing the things that I thought were weird about me, actually embracing those things, accepting those things. And I think that made a big difference.
What were some of those things I think are weird about you?
Well, I think one of those things, honestly, was my intelligence. It's interesting to grow up in the time that I grew up in, because I grew up at a time where, coming from a traditional Latin culture, intelligence was not valued.
Especially in women. Right?
And especially in women.
Yeah.
It wasn't acknowledged. And so I thought differently. I was entertained by my own mind, and I felt like that really set me apart. When people would be talking around me, they'd be talking about things that had absolutely no value to me.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I'm not trying to diminish their experience. It's
Mm-hmm.
just, it wasn't something I could relate to. So, I think there was that, where I just didn't feel like I was seeing the world or experiencing the world in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing is, I know this now. I didn't know it then, that, in addition to being intellectually very gifted in a world, you also have to remember, when I was a kid, people didn't identify giftedness.
Mm.
You all got the same education. You just, you blended in, you did all that. You didn't get that acknowledgement. And so I just felt different.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think another thing was just my spirituality. I mean, I came into this world with a very strong spiritual compass. And it was something that was always with me. Now I know that I'm also, spiritually gifted. Mm-hmm. And again, because of that, and what I mean by spiritually gifted, I just have a heightened sense of the spiritual experience. And what is, and I don't mean religion. I want to make that very clear. I grew up, and there's nothing wrong with religion. I grew up in a very religious household, and it never resonated with me. And I knew that from the time I could speak. Mm-hmm. That also set me apart, because, the practices, the things that my family talked about, it was like, I don't believe that. That doesn't make any sense to me. And so that just amplified my experience of not fitting in and feeling different. Mm. And so there was that. And I think also, because I couldn't relate, because I didn't feel similar, I think I continued to go more inward and more inward and more inward, which isolated me even more and more. Mm-hmm. And more. Mm-hmm. So it created an even stronger disconnect with people. So I think that's what happened for me. Mm. Yeah.
When did you feel like, you said this didn't happen until like maybe your 50s, like what do you think changed to like pull you out of that?
I think for me, I mean, I will tell you, pain is motivating. I'm not going to lie. And I think that I had so much emotional pain that, and it was for a lot of reasons. It was for the loneliness. It was a result of not feeling like I fit in. I mean, I didn't even feel like I fit in my own family. I didn't feel nurtured, embraced, supported, protected in my own family. And so nowhere did I feel like I belong. And so there was a lot of pain that went with that. And I'm sure you understand. I'm sure that you feel the pain. And I also had a lot of emotional pain because of all the trauma that I went through. And so for me, I went on this path. I mean, I started the path at about 29 mm-hmm. Of healing. And what I came, into my 50s to really recognize and appreciate the importance of was the most important part of healing was my own self-acceptance. Accepting and having compassion for myself was vital. And as I did that, what I noticed is with self-acceptance, I began to embrace these parts of myself mm-hmm. that no one else valued and I thought were wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what started with that healing. And I think what's really interesting too is that a lot of my work, I went inward and the healing was inward. I didn't go outward. Mm-hmm. And I think that was really important, that I feel like I needed to have that connection first and to really be okay with who I was. And so I think, this idea or this concept of radical self-forgiveness is not just a concept, it's a practice. And, it really makes a difference, because I think what happens is when you accept who you are, and then you take the next step of not only accepting who you are, but allowing yourself to have the courage to be vulnerable and show everybody else who you are, that's where connection comes from. you know? And so I think that's what really helped me, is getting to a place of self-healing, self-love, self-acceptance, self-forgiveness, and really committed to, it's a practice. It's not about just reading books. It's really about action. You know, every moment, you know, there are times that I can be literally in a moment and I can say, Charleanea, what are you going to choose here? Are you going to choose to continue to beat yourself up and make yourself wrong and judge yourself and experience the pain of that? Or are you going to choose to accept who you are and love who you are and embrace that? And to actually, rubber meets the road. You try it on and you're like, oh, this feels a lot better than this one. And, you know, old habits are hard to break, but I will say that, you know, I don't want that to sound like fluff. It really is something that is very practical. And it has a, you know, it's got a lot of weight to it. You know, it carries a big punch. It really does have a profound impact, you know?
I think I've never really thought about it like that. Like, I think I've just always been looking externally outwards and thinking, if I just do these things, I'm going to feel better. And so I think that turning inwards and that radical self-acceptance is more of what I could use for sure. I just internally, that's what I could use. Like, I'm curious if we were just to get like practical, like, what does that look like for me now? Like, I'm, 25 and how do I even begin to do that? Like,
well, that's a great question. And, this is one part of my experience generationally that I am grateful for, that I don't think that you have as much as. And
that's a great way to tee it up.
and that is one of the things that I really appreciated about, one of the things, there's not very many, I'll be honest, that one of the things that I really appreciated about my upbringing was that I grew up at a time when life was a lot more simple. And what I mean by that is, we didn't have social media. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have cell phones. We had 3 or 4 channels on our TV. I mean, it was very simple. And because it was very simple, there were things like, for example, on Sundays, everything was closed. Everything, grocery stores, department stores, everything was closed. So what was the result? You were either with your family or you were spending time alone. And that the having nothing to do, what I did was I went inward. That's what I did. I spent time with myself. I was being with myself. And I think that's something that your generation does not understand. It's like you have 24/7 constant stimulation. I mean, you can be on your phones, you can be on the internet, you can be on social media, you can be in chats, you can be on, video games 24/7. And every one of those things take you out of your being completely. And so I think part of what this generation is struggling with, I think loneliness, there's very personal, complex things about it, but I also think that there's a social context that feeds loneliness. And that is, I think that this generation is overstimulated. They are constantly watching, doing something. There's not that quiet time like I had on Sundays, right? Not only are they overstimulated, but they're shown outside of themselves how everything is better than they are. You have that social comparison and you're constantly being shown, it's in your face, how you don't measure up. That not measuring up makes you disconnect from yourself. You don't want to own this. You don't want to own what's here. And that connection is really important. I think the other thing that is really different is this generation, there's a shift in how they get information. In my generation, like if you think about this, how small our world was. You think about like when they were talking about like wars. Vietnam War was the first war on TV. No one had a clue what war was like until Vietnam War. And then you could see what happened as a result of that. In my generation, we got information from each other. We would go to people, we would go to elders, we would go to our grandparents, we'd go to our aunts and uncles, we'd go to older siblings. And we not only got the information, but we got the connection. Okay. This generation, they get their information from Google. They get their information from YouTube. So there's a complete lack of connection. There's no mentorship. There's none of the elderhood. There's none of the sharing of stories, because they're going to get the information from a very sterile laptop, computer, iPhone.
Yeah.
And I think, that's what, sets us apart in terms of the things that set us up for this chronic loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
So you went back to, what do I do? Here I am, 25, what I do. I think the first thing is going within, embracing all of these parts of yourself, the parts of you that you decided were not good enough and has kept you out of the world. Like, you mentioned being guarded. We have walls, we protect ourselves, we have armor, we have things. And the problem with that is that it prevents connection. And I believe that connection starts with ourselves. And then once we connect with ourselves and we accept ourselves and we embrace who we are and we like who we are and we celebrate who we are, then we feel like we have something to share with the world. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's first and foremost. I think the second thing is, I think it's important to limit social media. I really do. I think it's important to be off your phones. I think it's important to be off computers and, connect with yourself and have really meaningful connections. You don't have to have meaningful connections with tons of people. It could be one person, and, Brené Brown talks about wholehearted living, and living a life that is worth living. And she talks about the 3 elements of that. And that is courage to be vulnerable, let everybody see who you are. And that when you have the courage, you receive compassion from others. And that's what happens with connection. Mm. You feel connected. And if you think about this, I can say this for myself. I've done a lot of growth groups. I've done a lot of spiritual groups. And I will tell you the times that I have felt most connected to another human is when I have been vulnerable and I've shared genuinely who I am, whether it's hard, it can be positive things, it can be celebratory things, or it can just be really hard things. And when you are seen and you are seen and accepted through eyes of compassion, that is when you feel connected. Mm. And we don't do that. We're not even shown how to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate that. I think it's nice to have that tactical advice on where to go and where to go from there. And, I'm taking away this idea that you need to be really connected with yourself. And a part of that is knowing who you are, which is kind of what that interior time is for, time away from phones. Mm-hmm. I think I definitely, I go on my phone to feel connected to people. I think in my mind, I want to go on Instagram and see what my friends are up to. But I end up just feeling really just flat after. It's really disconnected from everything. So I think that's something I'm thinking a lot about, is how to connect more with myself. And with that, taking the next steps, vulnerability and willingness to share that aspects of who I am, things I've kind of kept hidden for myself for a long time, even for myself, that I've kept hidden. Mm-hmm. And I think it's cool to see you have been on that journey, and we've been on similar journeys. And I think it's cool to see you where you are now. And even I think just doing this podcast now is, I think, a really big, shift for you of stepping into your light and stepping into vulnerability and owning who you are. And, you've spent 30 something years of my entire life, at the minimum, past my entire life, working to heal people and understand people's relationships to each other, themselves, this world. And yeah, I think it's just really exciting to see you finally bring this into the next step and step into your power too.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Well, and I also think it's important, I do what I do and I help others. I'm only a few steps ahead of them. Mm. And I think that that's really important. I think that's also important for all of us. It's our responsibility. This is going to sound like a really interesting perspective. It's our responsibility to share who we are. We're here for a reason. We're here for a purpose. We are here to contribute to the greater whole. And so if we are guarded and we don't show people who we really are, then the world is missing out on something. And I think that's really important. And I think that's a really different perspective. And I am really excited about where I see things are starting to go. I think there's going to be a big shift. I know that things feel really hopeless right now. I also feel, they always say that, the way that nature works is we have these death cycles and rebirth cycles, right? And so we're at a time that we are in a death cycle. Things are starting to crumble. You're right. They're starting to crumble, and it's really scary. And at the same time, it's making room for the new. And I'm really excited about this. If you just look at what's out there, what people are talking about, they're talking about really important things. They're talking about vulnerability. They're talking about owning your story. They're talking about personal power is in owning your story. They're talking about sharing your gifts. They talk about, your wounds, your own personal wounds and your own challenges are going to be your superpower. That is going to be the thing that you come out into the world with. And I would say that I'm not exempt from that. I feel like what I do in this world is a direct result of my own trauma, my own challenges, my own adversity, my own struggles. And I feel like, we all owe it to each other. We all owe it to each other to move through those challenges and to accept who we are and embrace it and own it, and what would happen if we all did that? What if judgment fell away? I mean, I don't know if it ever will. I think that's human nature, but yeah, I mean, just imagine that. Imagine what the world would be like if there wasn't a concept of there's something wrong with me, or I don't fit in, or I'm really different. I mean, what would that be like if it wasn't a bad thing to be different, or it wasn't a bad thing to own all of who you are, I
want to live in that world.
I think we all do, right?